Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Caitlyn Wininger, and I'm obviously with Herzig Engineering. It's good to see so many people on here today. If you have any questions, comments, stories, concerns, jokes, whatever that may have you, please find the question or the chat feature, and that's how you're going to be able to interact with me today. I am observing that as we go. Barry, thank you so much for the feedback. Brian, Paul, Mike, all of you are already jumping on here and letting me know that you're ready to dive in. Today, we're going to talk about electrical safety training comparing OSHA versus NFPA 70E. So over the next half hour, we're going to look at the relationship between OSHA and NFPA, specifically their 70E standard, compare the training requirements, and then I'll very briefly talk about some best practices that can take you beyond compliance and more into some realistic best practices that we see nowadays. And if there's any time left over, we'll hopefully get into some questions and discussion as well. Just wanted to point out real quick, we have covered electrical safety training in various ways in previous webinars. So some of this content does overlap with those, some of it's new. But if you see something and you want more detail on it, if it falls under one of these topics, the qualifications of electrical workers, what you should train on for unqualified workers, and the difference between arc flash versus 70E training, we have previous webinars recorded already going in depth over those topics. Anytime we do these free electrical safety trainings online, we record it and we post it on our YouTube channel. So please always feel free to go back and watch the recordings and share it with anyone who might find that information helpful. All right, let's go ahead and dive in with the overview of OSHA and NFPA 70E's relationship. So I would like to point out that in OSHA, we have the electrical standards. Now there's the 29 CFR 1910 subpart S for general industry. There's also 1926 subpart K for construction. A lot of the electrical safety requirements whenever it comes to training and safe work practices overlap, or at least are comparable. So I'm going to pull mostly from the general industry, but just know if you work in a construction environment that a lot of this still applies pretty well directly as well. So looking at 1910-303, there's a part in there that talks about needing equipment to be free from recognized hazards that are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees. Now, OSHA is set up to tell you what is required, the minimum requirements to keep people out of the hospital or dead. That's the idea. And then you look to the NFPA codes and standards for how to accomplish that. So OSHA, as we know, recognizes arc flash and electric shock as hazards in general industry and require employers to understand the industry standards to protect workers. So that's where the NFPA 70E comes in. It is considered the recognized industry consensus standard, so failure to meet the NFPA 70E standards could actually be cited by OSHA within the regulations of their subchapter S under the general duty clause. So the OSHA regulations are the bare minimum requirements, and the 70E gives you more than enough guidance on how to comply with those bare minimum requirements. So if you don't at least meet what's out there as far as our recognized standards, and something goes wrong, OSHA can use those recognized standards to support their citations as an example for, well, you could have protected them because here's a million ways you could have. So some key differences here between OSHA and NFPA. This can help clarify your understanding of how to implement them. First of all, OSHA is a federal regulatory agency. 70E is the consensus standard. So they work together hand in hand, but they don't enforce each other. They support each other, they don't enforce each other. Then we've got the enforcement of it, right? So the OSHA regulations are legally enforceable. State and federal laws will implement OSHA regulations as part of workplace safety, workplace requirements. NFPA 70E is not considered law, but it is widely used to demonstrate compliance. So in other words, again, that how versus what. NFPA tells you how to comply with what OSHA requires, which is the next scope that I put there, just as a handout detail for you. The 70E also provides much more in-depth training and guidance. So OSHA can sometimes be intentionally vague. If you know anything about laws, they're trying to cover a large variety of applications in a very short period of sentencing, or very short structure of sentencing, whereas NFPA 70E has more flexibility to expand and explain. Some of it can be hard to understand in the 70E as well, but it certainly is more readily accepted and readable to laymen than OSHA regulations. Another key difference is that NFPA 70E is updated every 3 years. So the latest and greatest work practices and technologies are implemented every 3 years. That's much better than how often OSHA is updated, which is pretty infrequently. It can go decades sometimes, depending on the standard you're looking at. They do provide letters of interpretation. They do provide some additional guidance documents to help support the newer codes and standards and point to them. But as far as actually getting the standards in OSHA, the state or the federal OSHA regulations updated, it's like getting a law passed. It takes a lot of time and cutting through a lot of red tape to get that done. So as far as the requirements, a lot of people ask, is it even required to follow NFPA 70E? Like, does OSHA care? It's not their standard, so why do we need to follow it? I'm worried about OSHA compliance. Well, okay. A letter of interpretation from OSHA helps to clarify this. And I put out a couple snippets here of what's important. It's kind of a long letter. So OSHA views NFPA 70E as the primary consensus standard addressing electrical hazards associated with electrical utilization systems. OSHA may use NFPA 70E to support citations for violations relating to certain OSHA standards. So yeah, you should definitely be following the NFPA 70E at a minimum in order to comply with the OSHA standards. Again, if something goes wrong, they can point to the fact that you had a resource to tell you how to comply with these OSHA regulations, and you failed to do so. That can lead to costly citations, downtime. I mean, even worse, of course, is the injury or loss of life, but it impacts the organization completely as a whole. Just a little more information here on the NFPA 70E. So it is the standard for electrical safety in the workplace. It's considered a consensus standard, so it's not just a handful of people deciding what everybody else in the nation needs to do. It requires a lot of public input. So that means you and me, everybody on this call, everybody you know that knows anything about electrical work or engineering, by all means, that's what the public input is for. Provide that feedback on what you think could be improved or changed, and that committee that oversees the 70E has to go through with a fine-tooth comb all of that public input. It's a consensus standard. It's what all of our voices together have figured out and worked through to create a standard that pretty much everybody can follow. It was created in 1979. Per OSHA's request. So again, if you ever wonder, does OSHA care about NFPA's codes and standards? Well, for example, the 70E was created at the request of OSHA. So yes, the answer is yes, they care. Okay, they go hand in hand so very closely. They have a complete electrical safety program and training content. So let's compare the safety training requirements. Knowing that OSHA is rather vague and not vague, basic, I guess, fundamental, bare minimum requirements, right? And it's been a long time since they've really been updated. Just know that the training requirements from OSHA's 1910 subpart S is pretty short and sweet. There's all these subparts in electrical standards that need to be addressed. So what are the utilization systems and what are the requirements for those, wiring design and protection, hazardous classified locations, safe work practices, such and so forth. Then that 1910.332 specifically talks about what's required for the training. Mind you, you're going to be trained over all of those sections if it's a compliant training. But in that, it does talk about the scope of who is required to be trained and over what. So this applies to any and all employees who face the risk of electric shock, because they're exposed to it. So it's not suitably guarded, isolated, insulated, mitigated out, eliminated, whatever. It also talks about electric shock or other electrical hazards. So again, OSHA regulations, kind of older, out of date. The term arc flash is rarely, if ever, found. However, they do recognize there's more than just electric shock. So they say, we got to make sure that we address the risk of injury due to electric shock or electrical hazards in your training for anyone who might be exposed to those, okay? That includes the practices they have to use as part of their respective job assignments. For unqualified personnel, what do they need to know to be able to stay clear of those electrical hazards, and at what point should they not be the ones performing that work anymore? It also talks about more in-depth training requirements for qualified persons, really focusing again on that electric shock hazard because that was the main and only real focus whenever this was originally developed. Although arc flash, electrical burns, electrical fires, those are all included in the or other electrical hazards verbiage. So distinguishing exposed live parts from other parts of the equipment, what are the voltages, what are the boundaries associated with it, how do we select the right tools and PPE, the equipment needed to protect themselves and others, and then the training is going to be classroom, on the job, or a combination of the two. The type of training, the degree of it, is determined by the risk to the employee. So there's a lot of nuance there in the OSHA regulation as far as how you approach satisfying these minimum requirements. The only other thing in subpart S 1910-332 is a table talking about the typical people who need to have electrical safety training. By no means is this a complete list, but supervisors, of course, electrical engineers and electricians, those who work on this kind of stuff, machine operators, material handling equipment operators, mechanics, painters, riggers, welders. So not just electrical workers, but those who are commonly exposed to electrical hazards. Some people don't think about painters, but if they're gonna paint, they take off covers for light switches and outlets. Even something as simple as that, they have to have some kind of training for avoiding those hazards. Okay, that's essentially it in 1910.332, so the electrical safety training requirements. Notice it covers, generally speaking, you have to have the safety training in order to do your job safely. Know how to use the tools and equipment and resources needed for that task, how to identify the hazards, great. Now, another part that isn't in the subpart S, but it's actually thrown in subpart I, is about the electrical protective equipment, specifically the rubber insulating equipment. So that's a topic that you, of course, would need to train over. What is the design of the rubber insulating equipment, the gloves, the sleeves, the blanket requirements? What voltage are they good for? How often do you need to do testing and inspection, field test versus lab test? How do you use it appropriately and care for it? So that is part of the training that's called out, but it's just in a different section. Just wanted to highlight that for you. And again, like I said earlier, the 1926 subpart K, so the electrical standards for the construction industries, are overall comparable. It's a pretty close a one-to-one comparison as far as what's required to be trained on. Generally speaking, whatever electrical safety requirements are for that task to keep you safe, you got to be trained over it. Okay? And then in more detail, you can look to the NFPA 70E for what they require. So the cool thing about this is as you are reading the OSHA standards with the 70E standards, you're going to notice some of the verbiage actually is exactly the same. It's like one of them copy and pasted to the other. Well, years back, it's my understanding that an old edition of the 70E did get adopted, parts of it, into OSHA. Some people are trying to work with OSHA and update to a later version of 70E as well, so that it is directly required per our regulations. Again, a lot of hoops to jump through, a lot of red tape to work through, but that is a goal because we want to stop this ambiguous relationship issue. Okay, I digress. Let's get back into the agenda today. So once again, this 70E is going to go into more deep detail, not just what's required, but why and how to approach it. So this is where I'm going to say I'm about to fly through a bunch of content because this was covered in previous trainings, previous videos. I'm going to hit the highlights, I'm going to refresh on you, but I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail simply because of our time constraints today. Okay, so for the 110.4 training requirements in NFPA 70E, this applies to all employees who are exposed to electrical hazards, any of them, shock, arc flash, arc blast, electrical fires, whatever it may be, especially if they're going to be in an area where that electrical work is performed. Again, they're exposed to it potentially. So you have to understand those specific hazards, what procedures and work practices you need to put into place, and any protective equipment, such and so forth, yada, 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 associated with their respective jobs or tasks, okay? And a big part of that training is knowing, well, what happens if I don't follow that? Well, you could get hurt or killed, but what does that look like? How does that happen? So again, the electric shock, arc flash, and arc blast hazards are the main ones talked about in NFPA 70E. By and large, looking at electric shock and arc flash. Arc blast is mentioned, there's some content, but there's just simply less. But, you know, it's a step up. OSHA only really calls out the shock hazard and then says, and anything else, right? Other stuff too. 70E gets more specific. Here's the other common ones as well. Okay, and then it goes into the qualified persons specifically. So A1 is qualified persons, A2 is unqualified persons. You got to know the appropriate, how to read the appropriate labels and signs, follow your policies and procedures, use the right PPE, such and so forth. And note that you can be qualified for some things, but not others. So your training should be developed around what you're going to be qualified to do. Someone who works on replacing outlets and light switches, their training requirements are limited compared to somebody who is also going to be able to get into the main switchgear for your facility. They both have electrical safety training requirements, both need to be audited because you're exposed to 50 volts or greater, both have to be considered qualified electrical workers. I just want to make that clear. But, you know, the one guy's not going to be able to be qualified for everything else. You just got to keep that in mind. So, big part of understanding the training requirements is understanding how to identify the hazards they're potentially facing, the severity, what PPE to wear, how do you read those safety labels. So a good training program is going to go in depth on each of those elements that are found on your electrical hazard labels. So the incident energy, the arc flash boundaries, PPE, such and so forth, and the voltage information as well. Okay? For the boundaries, reinforcing that, hey, wherever the furthest boundary is the bare minimum that you have to set up your work area to keep unqualified or honestly even just qualified people who aren't protected outside of those boundaries. The moment you cross the boundary, if it's exposed, you have to have your protective equipment on. So establish the boundaries first and foremost, right? I'll get into this very briefly in a moment, but this is the bare minimum. I always say add a foot or two. Whatever the furthest boundary is, add a foot or two. Because if it's the shock boundary that's the furthest, if you look at the distance, it's really only 3.5 feet. That's barely enough elbow room. Make it 5 feet, right? For medium and high voltage stuff, it's further, sure, but for low voltage, the vast majority of applications, 3.5 feet, let's bump it out to 5. And then the arc flash boundary. That's not the point where people are safe. It is calculated to 1.2 calories per centimeter squared. They could still walk away with a second-degree burn if they're standing right at the boundary, like so many people do, right? So I say bump it out another couple feet. Protect people from second-degree burns as well. Again, bare minimum versus best practice is something to consider. And then once they cross that boundary, you have to make sure that they know what PPE to wear and how to wear it properly. You know, I think a lot of times people get into PPE because that is the easy risk control method, frankly. Oh, just put on your PPE if you're exposed to anything. Oh, just put on PPE if you're going to have a risk. Which, fair. You're really not going to get away from it, but it's not the only thing to address. There's 5 other more effective risk control methods you should be considering first. But don't just say put on PPE. Make sure they know how to put it on properly. There's too many times I go out there and I see people with coveralls or, shirt and pants, and stuff's left unbuttoned and sleeves are rolled up and the gloves are tucked into the sleeves, or the gloves are swapped. They put the leather on and then the rubber over the top of it. I mean, I've seen all kinds of crazy things because people just assume that you know how to put it on properly. And you know what they say about the word assume? Makes you look silly, so don't do that. Let's not assume anything. Let's go ahead and get in depth, make people practice it, especially if they're gonna have to be wearing it pretty regularly. Let's make sure they practice it before you sign off on it. If it's been a long time since they've done any work with PPE on, then I would say make them buddy up, buddy system. You have people cross-check, cross-reference. Did I put this on right? Did I remember my hearing protection? That's one of the most commonly overlooked elements, such and so forth. Kind of same idea with the higher levels, the full 40 cal suit. Just because you have it doesn't mean people know how to put it on properly. Inspect it, care for it, all those things. More information about the training requirements for qualified persons. This is the part where you're going to start to see some word for word, like skills and techniques necessary to distinguish exposed electrical conductors or circuit parts from other parts of electrical equipment. That's very much in line with what OSHA says, okay? Such and so forth. Including the decision-making processes. So being able to perform job safety planning and risk assessments, including implementing risk control methods. So thinking about the likelihood of an event and the severity if it did happen, the two different factors there, and all the things that go into determining those levels. You come up with your risk, and if it's anything other than that bottom left corner, dark green, desirable area, then what action should they take? Well, training over next the risk control hierarchy can go a long way. Like I said, PPE is the most common one people go for, but your safety training should go into all of them and emphasize that there is an order for a specific reason, because elimination is the best case scenario. The process of eliminating can sometimes be hazardous, so you have to get a little more nuanced there, but ideally, we only work whenever the power's off. And how do we get it off while being safe? You start implementing other risk control methods too. Okay, so that's all needing to be trained over. On the job training, make sure that you are performing their duties and you're going to be specific on what duties they're allowed to be performing. If they're still under training, not qualified yet, you can sign them off on a task-by-task scenario. There's all kinds of ways that you can approach this. A big part of the training is that live, dead, live verification of absence of voltage at each point of work to get an electrically safe work condition. So this is another training topic that I personally would spend a lot of time on. Live, dead, live. I know those who have been in my electrical safety trainings are aware, very aware, that I repeat myself a lot during this section because it is so pivotal. It is so important because if you do this wrong, if you miss steps or you miss some of those electrical conductors or circuit parts that you should have tested, it could still be energized, and then you think it's off, but it's not, and then you take your PPE off, take your boundaries down, you get to work, and anyone in the area, including yourself, could actually be exposed to hazards and not even know it because you thought you did it right. So I spend a lot of time in this section, and I would recommend you do as well. Make sure it's dead before you ever interact with that equipment, especially if you're going to be removing PPE and setting back the boundaries, putting down the boundaries. Okay. And then there's also the auditing piece, determining through regular supervision that they are still following and complying with the 70E's requirements. So not just train on it, but verify their competency in these safe work practices on an annual basis. I usually see this as a pass-fail criteria, all right? So opening up an enclosure, did they set up the boundaries? Did they inspect their PPE? Did they put everything on properly? Are they looking around and determining whether or not they need a second person? Are they establishing a buddy system when needed? Do they have the meter in hand ready to verify absence of voltage? All these things should be done without prompting. If they fail something, maybe it's time to reevaluate your training process. Sometimes it's just people forget, fine. But double check that it was adequately covered in your training too. And if not, improve it, get everyone up to speed. Okay, so that's all the stuff for qualified persons, and then it gets more into unqualified persons very, very briefly, saying they also need to be trained, whatever's necessary for their safety. I'm glad that they put this in here so I can specifically highlight non-electrical workers, because when we look at statistics, 70 to 75% of electrical fatalities in the workplace are non-electrical occupations. That's horrendous. They shouldn't have even been exposed to the electrical hazards, and they're dying from them. How? Maybe they don't know the boundaries. Maybe they don't understand what they mean, and so that's something that you need to train over. How far out can these hurt you, and how? You don't have to touch electrical equipment for it to hurt you or kill you. Arc over is a reality. Arc flash is a reality. Those two different things, by the way. So again, going over those boundaries, really reinforcing, don't be standing toes on the line and leaning over and trying to see what the person's doing because it looks cool. I get it, it does, but you could be actually entering a hazardous area by doing that on accident. Certainly, don't duck under it and, oh, I'm just gonna, oops, sneak right past you real quick. Don't be doing that either, right? I see that all the time. So making sure those non-electrical workers actually respect the boundaries can go a long way too. And there's more details that you could get into, but that's kind of just a highlight that I like to make here. Additional training and retraining, qualified or unqualified, is every 3 years at a minimum. Of course, if you see people doing something that's unsafe, if you're going through that annual inspection and they are not complying with it, if there's new tasks or new equipment or new safety-related work practices used, retrain them. Don't just assume people can adapt in the moment. Retrain over those new or changed procedures. Again, very, very similar to what OSHA says here. Classroom, on the job, or a combination of the two, type and extent determined by risk to the employee. I always recommend both. The training does need to be documented. Retain it for the length of your employment. Another piece of training is lockout tagout. Again, I am flying through this here because I went into more detail about that, but lockout tagout's a big part of your training as well. Same idea with contact release, although this is an annual training requirement. So if someone's locked on or hung up, how do you identify that? Well, ideally, there's a buddy system, and that's something that I would train qualified people over and unqualified, because sometimes you don't have two qualified persons to establish that buddy system. So I would say both. That look at where the power supplies are, what insulated shepherd's hook or other source of release or rescue device can you use. A lot of people say 2x4s. I would go into in depth about the caution there. Again, we've gone through this in other trainings, other webinars. Please don't hesitate to go back and watch the recordings. Emergency response training, CPR, AED, what else? First aid. Who's going to be in charge of that? They need to be trained as well. And all of those training requirements need to be verified that everyone who needs to be trained is still up to date on an annual basis. Not that the training's every year, but they're verifying that training is complete and up to date every year. So here's an example, just summary as an agenda for you. How people get hurt, what are the warning labels and boundaries, what do they mean, what PPE, when can you assume or not assume, when can you know for a fact that it is off, not just turned off and locked out. That's the electrically safe work conditions. What risk assessment process are you going to use? You know, there's some fundamental things you can teach across the board, but maybe you have your own forms and processes. And then what risk control methods can you implement to lower that risk? What tools and meters should they use? What are their ratings? How do you inspect those? And testing them, either written test, in the field, both. Ideally, survey them, evaluate them, observe them, putting these work practices to the test. Some quick tips on going beyond compliance, but actually looking at best practices. I would say go ahead and update your safety program to include those best practices, like I was saying earlier, buffering the boundaries, adding a foot or two to whatever boundary you come up with, whichever one's the furthest, add a couple feet. Have conservative PPE approaches. You know, technically, if your stuff is rated for 8 cals and the hazard level says 7.5, it's okay. I would say best practice, if it's within a calorie or two, go ahead and grab the next level up, layer up, do something that's a little more conservative. Don't push it right to the edge. And of course, implementation of those buddy systems. That's another common recommendation I see. It's not technically required, but it is highly recommended in many circumstances. And then in turn, update your safety training to include those best practices as well. And once you implement it into your electrical safety program, it is now a requirement for your employees, not just a best practice. If you need help, you can get people like myself, certified electrical safety compliance professionals through NFPA, to provide feedback and resources. That is something that I'm always willing and able to help with. Real quick, one more time. A lot more content has already been covered over electrical safety training, qualified, unqualified, boundaries, arc flash versus 70E, shock protection, arc flash protection. We have done a whole bunch of material covered in previous free webinar recordings that you can watch on YouTube. Go to the handouts tab in GoToWebinar and you can download a PDF of these slides. Anything that's linked, like to this YouTube channel, you'll be able to click from that PDF. Also, it's good to just have this slide deck as a reference for yourself. If you need any help, like I said, we can definitely get into that. Arc flash studies, training, audits, written programs, we can do a lot of different stuff. Highlighting the training piece, I can actually go over and create a custom training even over your specific policies and procedures. If you don't necessarily need that, maybe you just need that general compliance, yeah, that's of course something that we offer as well. Classroom style, hands-on exercises, breakout discussions, even an exam at the end if you would like, including those audits. We have unqualified, qualified, and leadership potential options for you. Okay, now I will note that the auditing piece will help you with determining who should or should not be qualified. I'm not going to tell you who's qualified or not, but I can give you a recommendation on what I think based on their knowledge and their practices. All right. I feel like I was talking like an auctioneer this whole 30 minutes, so I just realized it's a couple minutes after the webinar time was supposed to be over. I sincerely appreciate you guys sticking around and listening to this, because understanding what's required and why is the first step to achieving compliance, but more importantly, to making sure that your employees or you yourself have the tools and resources to be safe. Okay? All right, with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I am pulling up the question feature again. Please go ahead and type out your questions or discussion commentary in there, and I will be happy to answer it. Otherwise, you can always email me. My email's on the screen there, or you can just call the office and ask for Caitlyn. I'm the only Caitlyn here, so please don't hesitate to reach out. I love being able to talk to you guys about this stuff. It's very important to me, and I want to make sure that you have the tools and resources necessary to get the job done. All right, let's go ahead and get into the Q&A portion of this. Does OSHA also require following the NFPA 70B? Okay, Paul's good question here. So the NFPA 70B, for those who don't know, it is the standard for electrical equipment maintenance. It became a standard in 2023. So we have had a couple years with it being a quote-unquote standard now, and it is an industry consensus standard, just like the 70E. So the same commentary can apply, although we have not seen that verbiage described directly from OSHA like we have in the letter of interpretation talking about 70E. So it's an NFPA standard, it's a consensus standard. So it's the same format, same concept as 70E, just focused on equipment and maintenance. Logically, it will eventually become in line, on par with the 70E. Because it's a couple years old, you know, sometimes people think, well, that's long enough, you should be able to adopt it. Other times people think, well, that's not even one cycle of it being a standard. How can we expect to be compliant with it? You know, I think it's in the Wild West at the moment. Again, I think it will eventually look to the 70B like it does the 70E, I mean OSHA. But as of right now, I haven't heard that happen yet. It's a good thing to start preparing for. Again, they're very much in line here. That was a long-winded response for a relatively simple question. I apologize for that. But it's a good question. All right. have a comment here about the webinars being a good resource before you pull out the books, and I appreciate that. You know, I try to simplify it and essentially put it into layman's terms because I've read through it and I know it's kind of hard to read through sometimes. So I'm glad that it's a helpful resource to explain what the codes and standards are saying. That's my goal for sure. So I'm glad to hear that. Brian, thank you. I'm glad it was informative. Thank you, Cody. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. Martin, thank you. Fernando here. Why are there projects where electrical inspector doesn't apply OSHA requirements? Is an inspection not completed? So sometimes electrical inspectors aren't, well, I guess there's a couple ways to think about this. There's the electrical inspectors and then there's OSHA inspectors. Electrical inspectors, they should be referencing OSHA as well. I would be highly surprised if they didn't. If they're already auditing based on the NFPA codes and standards, OSHA's definitely covered. Like if you follow NFPA codes and standards, by default, you end up also complying with OSHA standards. The opposite isn't necessarily true, okay? NFPA standards go a step further usually, okay? If it's an OSHA inspector that maybe isn't catching electrical stuff, that's not super surprising. You know, not everybody in their workforce is considered an electrical inspector, and so things can be overlooked in that regard. More and more are getting trained on how to identify and audit electrical standards though, so just keep that in mind as well. Mike, thank you so much. I appreciate the feedback. All right, guys, any other questions, comments, concerns? I was saving the joke, Mike, earlier. I'm gonna scroll back now. I figured that'd be a good way to end here. Let's see. All right, we got a nice little joke to wrap us up here today. What did Johnny's mother do when she caught him zapping the other children with static electricity? She grounded him, but all right, very good, very good. Thank you so much for your time today, guys, and I look forward to the next one. Go home safely, guys.